Good evening, everyone. Hi. Welcome. My name is Emily Shields. I'm from the Cambridge Women's Commission here in Cambridge. And the Women's Heritage Project, which is a collaboration of the Women's Commission and the Historical Commission and community volunteers, is very pleased to bring to you Barbara Berenson, author of Massachusetts in the Women's Suffrage Movement, Revolutionary Reformers. Barbara has also authored the books Boston in the Civil War, Hub of the Second Revolution, and Walking Tours of Civil War Boston, Hub of Abolitionism. She is co-editor of Breaking Barriers, the unfinished story of women lawyers and judges in Massachusetts. Currently, she serves on the boards of Boston by Foot and the Royal House and Slave Quarters. As most of you probably know, next year marks the 100th anniversary of women's suffrage in the United States. Please keep a lookout for a number of local events, public art displays, and workshops that will be celebrating, examining, critiquing, and digging deeper for a more complete story to commemorate this anniversary. And if you'd like to know more about these events or anything that the Women's Commission or Women's Heritage Project is doing, you can join our mailing list on our website. So please join me in welcoming Barbara Berenson.
Thank you, Emily, and thank you to all the wonderful sponsors of this event. It's really a privilege to be here, and it's so wonderful to hear all the exciting plans that Cambridge has for the centennial of the 19th Amendment, which is so soon upon us. It should be a fascinating time. What I'm going to do tonight is talk to you mostly about my book. I'll try to draw some connections to the present, but when we have time at the end for Q&A, I do encourage you to offer your own thoughts and insights, and also to draw connections to the present. I mean, one of the important things about this anniversary is that it celebrates some wonderful work that was accomplished, but also hammers home the incredible amounts of work still to be done. Not only on women's rights, but also, of course, on voter rights more generally. So what I'm going to do is begin by telling you why I decided to write this book. I have a day job as a lawyer at the Massachusetts Supreme Judicial Court. So I wrote this book. This was a labor of love, something I was passionate about. And one of the things that led me to write it, I was thinking about it anyway, because I had written a book, as you heard, about Boston's abolitionists. And you may know, and I'll certainly talk more about in a moment, how the women's rights movement emerged from within the anti-slavery or abolitionist movement. So I was thinking about it, and then I decided for sure when I made a trip to Washington, D.C., and saw for the first time a statue I had seen in the past but kind of had forgotten about, which is this monument in the U.S. Capitol to women's suffrage. And it depicts, as some of you may know, three very important suffragists: Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Susan B. Anthony, and Lucretia Mott. And they are indeed important, but they are not the whole story. And so many people think that two of these women, particularly Stanton and Anthony, sometimes all three of them, or a couple of others, are the whole story. And the reality is that the story involved tens of thousands of women, but even if you stick to the narrow leadership, it involved far more than these three. And most particularly, Lucy Stone of Massachusetts was very, very central and has really been underserved by history. So I decided that what I would do is write a complete history of the suffrage movement. It's relatively short because the publisher wanted it for the general reader, and explain why it took 80 years, why it was such a long, hard struggle. To explore Massachusetts' role at the center of the complete story, both in terms of its own role as a state, but also as a center of some national organizations, and why this story has been little known until now, why it's really been obscured from view. I wish I could cover all those things tonight. I only have do I have about an hour? I'm not sure exactly how long I have, probably about an hour. So what I'm going to do is highlight several key episodes, and hopefully that will whet your appetite for more during Q&A and or to buy the book, which is for sale outside. So I'm going to begin at the beginning, which is not a simple statement, because when you're writing history, one of the first challenges always is what is the starting point? When do you decide you begin a movement? And many of you have probably seen or read, whether things you read yourself, things you learned in school, what your children or grandchildren are doing in school, statements that say something like, The women's rights movement began in Seneca Falls, New York in 1848 when Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott called a convention. Is that familiar to everybody here? And by the way, can everybody hear fine? Okay. Well, that is true. They did have this convention. It was the first women's rights convention, and it was important. But it begs the question of what had been going on that led them to think the time was ripe to call together people to talk about women's rights for the first time ever. They didn't just wake up one morning and say, oh, this is a subject that's never been discussed before. Something must have happened. And what had happened was the beginning of a women's rights movement emerged from within the anti-slavery movement that was centered in Boston, Massachusetts. William Lloyd Garrison, a name that's likely familiar to all of you, was in the early decades, certainly, the nation's foremost abolitionist. He was from Newburyport, Massachusetts, and in 1831, he began a newspaper in Boston, Massachusetts called The Liberator. And the newspaper was dedicated to the immediate and total eradication of slavery from the southern United States. Garrison was a radical publisher and reformer, and he did several things besides publishing this newspaper, important as it was. The first was he invited blacks and women, as well as white men, to join him in this new abolitionist movement. The other thing is he wanted to organize a social movement, and he decided that the way to do that were to form what he called anti-slavery societies, small groups of people dedicated to the anti-slavery movement who would speak to their friends and their neighbors and so forth and try to get more people to join this new anti-slavery movement so that it would grow and become more powerful. And he did that. And a number of women joined in the anti-slavery movement. As I said, Garrison welcomed them. One of the earliest was a black woman named Mariah Stewart, whose name may or may not be familiar to some of you, who actually spoke in Boston about the evils of slavery in the early 1830s. There's no surviving image of her, or I put her photo on the screen. A turning point came for the women's rights part of the story in 1837 when two women named Angelina and Sarah Grimke, just out of curiosity, how many of you have heard of the Grimke sisters? Oh, good, a lot of people, because 20 years ago, I bet almost no hands would have gone up. Angelina and Sarah Grimke were from Charleston, South Carolina, obviously a bastion of Southern slavery and conservatism. They grew up in this home. Their father and their relatives were all major slaveholders. And they, for a story that I don't have time to go into now, but they both became converted to the anti-slavery cause, which was extremely unusual for white privileged women from the South. They moved to Philadelphia, and they joined a female anti-slavery society led by Lucretia Mott. In 1835, Angelina Grimke wrote a letter to William Lloyd Garrison, essentially praising the work he was doing. And Garrison recognized immediately how powerful it would be if he could have Angelina and Sarah speak out against slavery. This was, of course, long before people like Frederick Douglass had self-emancipated themselves. So there really were not yet former enslaved Africans on the scene to talk firsthand about their experiences with Southern slavery. So the Grimke sisters being able to talk about what they had witnessed, the cruelties of it, seemed to Garrison very powerful. And he asked if they would be willing to be trained as anti-slavery agents or lecturers, and they agreed. Now, that was a very daring proposition because in the 1830s, women in this country were supposed to be confined to what was known as the domestic sphere. Just like its name suggests, the sphere of home, children, taking care of the home, and being subservient even within the home because the man, the husband, was the undisputed head of the family. And men were supposed to not only be the heads at home, but also the ones who would operate in the worlds of business and politics. So women were supposed to be silent, largely silent beings at home in the domestic sphere. So it was daring to even train Angelina and Sarah Grimke. But Garrison, as radical as he was, he still anticipated that they would speak to audiences of women. It seemed so radical that a woman would speak to audiences of men and women that wasn't really even contemplated. So the Grimkes were trained, and in the summer of 1837, they were asked to go on a long speaking tour throughout Massachusetts over about an 8-week period, organized by some of Garrison's female allies in the abolitionist movement. Angelina did most of the public speaking. She was the more comfortable speaker of the two sisters. And as they began to speak, something surprising happened, and that is men began to come too. Now, men may have come for a variety of different reasons. Some came out of curiosity, some came out of interest or support, some came to make fun of them, some came because there was nothing else to do. Public lectures were a popular form of entertainment back then. But whatever the reasons, men began to come too. And that was a radical proposition that upset many conservative people as they learned about it, but particularly the conservative and very powerful Congregational ministers of Massachusetts. And they wrote a letter that summer that they ordered to be read from every pulpit throughout Massachusetts. And the letter said in part, "When a woman assumes the place and tone of a man as a public reformer, her character becomes unnatural, and the way is opened for degeneracy and ruin." And on the theory that sometimes a picture really is worth 1,000 words, I thought this illustrated pretty well what they meant by degeneracy and ruin. The fear that life would be turned topsy-turvy, that a woman might leave her home and go off in a coach driven by a woman, that her husband would remain at home sewing and tending the baby, and that a male servant would be doing laundry. They expected, of course, the Grimke sisters to sit down and be quiet after this condemnation from the Congregational ministers. I know that everybody sitting here knows what happens next, of course, which is the Grimke sisters did no such thing. They continued to stand behind the podium and speak, but they also picked up their pens. And they wrote a series of public letters that were published in the abolitionist press, in which they did two things. One was they criticized slavery, and the other was they defended a woman's right to speak out on important political issues. The letters are online, you can read them, they are fascinating, but I pulled out just a couple of particularly provocative or salient quotes. Sarah, for her part, said that there are few things which present greater obstacles to the improvement and elevation of woman to her appropriate sphere, yet not the domestic sphere, but her appropriate sphere of usefulness and duty, than laws that she has no voice in establishing. And Angelina, for her part, said, "I contend that woman has just as much right to sit in solemn council in conventions, conferences, associations, and assemblies as man, just as much right to sit in the presidential chair of the United States." Remarkable statement, 1837. So the Grimke sisters continued to speak out, although less so beginning the following year. They had both become ill from all their hard work. Angelina married a fellow abolitionist and moved to New Jersey, where she had 3 children. She continued to write, continued to speak, but they both, and Sarah goes with her, they both sort of drop out of public view to some extent over the next years. And a number of women picked up the cause. Again, tonight, I'm really going to just talk about a small number of leaders, or you would be dizzy with all the names and pictures. But nobody was more important right after the Grimkes than a woman named Allie Kelly Foster of Worcester County, Massachusetts. She picked up the mantle, spoke out against slavery, defended a woman's rights to do so, traveled near and far, both within Massachusetts and beyond, and developed what she called her bloody feet, as she walked near and far, standing in front of audiences, preaching against slavery, as I said, and her right to do so. The next major figure arrives on the scene in the late 1840s, Lucy Stone of Massachusetts, also from Worcester County. She was born in West Brookfield. She was born in 1818, and she, beginning in 1847, delivered lectures against both slavery and also separate lectures on the subject of women's rights. Now, Lucy Stone was a remarkable person her whole life. She was a farm girl, as so many of the early abolitionist women were. She graduated from primary school and became a local rural school teacher. She was desperate to continue her own education, and by working hard and saving money for a number of years, at about age 25, she was able to go to Ohio and enter Oberlin College. Oberlin was a new school, a radical school, that was dedicated to providing a strong liberal arts education to blacks as well as whites and women as well as men. Lucy Stone graduated from Oberlin in 1847, and while she was there, she had a chance to hear from many leaders of the anti-slavery cause, including William Lloyd Garrison, Abby Kelly Foster, and also Frederick Douglass, who by then had self-emancipated himself and emerged as a leading anti-slavery spokesperson. So in 1847, when Lucy Stone graduated from Oberlin, she became a lecturer for the New England Anti-Slavery Society, but also delivered separate lectures devoted to the subject of women's rights. And these really are, in the United States, the first lectures entirely devoted to the subject of a woman's right to speak out and hold important positions. So that, in about 10 minutes or so, gets us up to the end of the 1840s almost, what I call the phase of oratory. And we're now going to turn and talk about how you move from an oratory, primarily movement, to an organization. And the argument I make in my book is that the organized women's suffrage movement was actually launched in Worcester in 1850. Now, before that, of course, you had the Seneca Falls Convention of 1848, held in this abolitionist Methodist chapel in Seneca Falls. That was organized by Elizabeth Cady Stanton, who had lived for a number of years in Boston before she and her husband moved to upstate New York. Lucretia Mott, who was from Philadelphia, as I mentioned, who had a sister who lived in Seneca Falls. And that summer of 1848 in July, when Mott was visiting, she and Stanton and Mott's sister and two other women gathered together and talked about the new spirit in the air and all the wrongs done to women. Now you sort of start to understand the context. And they decided that they would announce and hold a convention 10 days later to talk about injustices done to women. Mostly women came, but men were invited too, and some men came, and about 300 people gathered in this chapel with, as I said, 10 days' notice. Before the convention began, Elizabeth Cady Stanton created a document that you probably have all heard of, the Declaration of Sentiments. And in that document, using the American Declaration of Independence as a model, she listed wrongs done to women, similarly to what the colonists had said about King George III, and made claims for their rights: the right to divorce, the right to custody of children following divorce, the right to higher education, the right to enter the professions, and very importantly, the right to vote. So this was in 1848, but it was a one-off, a one-time endeavor. There was not yet an organized movement. And Stanton was very aware of that. And in fact, a couple of months after the convention, she wrote to one of her close friends, an abolitionist named Amy Post, "Do you not think we ought to have a lecturer to travel all over the country and lecture on this subject? Lucy Stone, I think, might be engaged for this purpose." That did not happen, but it certainly illustrates how far and wide Lucy Stone's fame had spread already in this 1 year since she finished Oberlin. There were two other local conventions held after Seneca Falls, another one in upstate New York and one in Ohio. And in 1850, Lucy Stone, Abby Kelly Foster, and some of their allies, particularly in Massachusetts, but also from Rhode Island and some other local states, decided that the time was ripe to hold the first ever national women's rights convention. They gave 6 months' notice so that people could travel from near and far. They called it national. Now, by national, they meant northern. In the South, which was busy defending the institution of slavery, certainly the subject, a radical subject like women's rights, was not on the agenda. But they invited people from all across the North, and women and some men from 11 states attended. Very importantly, they called it the first National Women's Rights Convention. Already they were thinking about the future and the need for there to be a second and a third and a fourth and so forth to start to build momentum. And why Worcester? Well, it was, of course, the home county of both Abby Kelly Foster and Lucy Stone, but more importantly for this purpose, it was a major transportation crossroads running north-south and east-west. It was also a thriving manufacturing city, a reformist city. It seemed like an excellent place to hold such a convention. And the convention was a resounding success. Over 1,000 people attended from 11 northern states. Now, in this early part of the suffrage era, but this would remain true during much of it, as we'll talk about later on this evening, the suffrage movement leaders, the women's rights movement, and I should explain that you really call it the women's rights movement before the Civil War, when the search for the vote was just one of a long list of topics. It really coalesces and becomes the women's suffrage movement after the Civil War. But the leaders were largely, like Lucy Stone and Abby Kelly Foster, white, literate, native-born, and Protestant. But there were already a few exceptions, most particularly Sojourner Truth, a self-emancipated slave from New York when New York still had slavery, attended this convention and spoke at it. She did not deliver her famous Ain't I a Woman speech there. That happened the next year. But she was there, and there were several others who brought in some diversity early on, but it was largely a white, native-born Protestant movement. I wish I could talk in great detail about each of these next conventions because each is incredibly fascinating, but I want to give you a high-level overview tonight. But you can see there were conventions held all through the 1850s. The only year missing here is 1857, which was also the year of an economic depression in this country and the year that Lucy Stone, who married in 1855, had her only child. Susan B. Anthony appears on the scene in 1852 when she attends the convention held in Syracuse and pledges her life to women's rights. During the 1850s, Anthony and Stone were very close friends, very close allies. Elizabeth Cady Stanton is also very important. She's sort of the third leader, but she's still off in upstate New York where she has 7 children, so she communicates almost entirely by letter. Now, one of the things that makes, of course, the suffrage story complicated over 80 years is that you always have to think about what else was going on in this country. And of course, during the 1850s, as the women's movement is still tiny, but getting its grounding, growing slowly, the other thing that, of course, was happening is that the nation was edging closer to civil war over the institution of slavery in the South. And civil war began, as you all know, in April 1861, soon after Abraham Lincoln took office. So what happened during the Civil War? Officially, the movement was suspended during the Civil War so that the women's rights activists, all of whom, of course, had come initially first, or almost all of whom, to the anti-slavery movement, could devote themselves to the Union war effort and support it in whatever ways they could. But some of the things that happened during the war were very important for what would come next. So women's roles expanded during the Civil War. This has been true of American history always, that wartime provides new opportunities for women because men are now busy fighting. So women became nurses, for example. They managed homes and farms and businesses while their husbands, fathers, sons, brothers, etc., were away fighting. They also gathered and created, whether by knitting, sewing, all sorts of supplies for both soldiers in the field and ill and injured soldiers at hospitals. They were often called sanitary societies that gathered these provisions and organized shipments and so forth. And a lot of women developed all sorts of organizational skills that would be very useful after the Civil War. These sanitary societies, in fact, are the precursors to women's clubs and other gatherings of women in the post-war years. As for our key leaders, Stone, Anthony, and Stanton, they focused politically on supporting efforts to end slavery in the country. As you all know, of course, when the war began, Lincoln was pledged to preserving the Union, but not to the end of slavery. They worked with the abolitionists to help persuade Abraham Lincoln to issue an Emancipation Proclamation and then to support the 13th Amendment that in 1865, after the war was over, did finally and permanently eradicate slavery from the United States. So what happened next? Well, after the Civil War, there was a new battleground, and the new battleground was directly over the ballot. Because during the war, Frederick Douglass and many other abolitionists had said, the only thing that can protect the formerly enslaved is the ballot. That is, after all, the most important tool in the democratic toolbox. Stanton and Anthony and Stone said, yes, 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 we agree. But what we want, of course, is universal suffrage, suffrage for women as well as men, for blacks as well as whites. And they expected their abolitionist allies to agree. I mean, after all, they had worked closely together in the anti-slavery movement. This was a petition for universal suffrage. The first several names on it are Stanton, Anthony, Stone, and Stone's sister-in-law. But it turns out that there was a schism over the 15th Amendment after the war. And the 15th Amendment, as you all know, of course, is the amendment that granted voting rights to all men, regardless of prior servitude. It's the amendment that made it possible for black men to vote in this country. And the abolitionists, who still briefly controlled Congress for a brief window of time after the Civil War, before all the states of the former Confederacy had been readmitted and all, were not interested at that time in universal suffrage. They said it was, in the words of Wendell Phillips, a Boston abolitionist, the Negro's hour. And there were several reasons for this. The first is that black men, once they were allowed, had enlisted in the war and fought with great bravery. And there was this association between bullets and ballots in the minds of many, that if you're brave enough to be shot at, that should move you to the front of the line when it comes to getting the ballot. So that was one very important reason. Another reason was pure politics. The Republicans, there were still radical abolitionists who controlled Congress, were quite confident of how black men were going to vote. The former slaves in the South, if they were allowed to vote, they were going to vote for the Republican Party, the party of Abraham Lincoln. They didn't have any confidence like that about women. They knew that women's votes were much more likely to reflect the diverse affiliations of the overall population. Then, of course, there were some abolitionists who didn't support women's rights. I mean, they weren't all liberal on that issue. And then there were some who simply felt that it was too much to expect the public to consider two radical issues at the same time. So for these various reasons, it was decided that the 15th Amendment would focus only on male suffrage. And that led in 1869 to a schism among these former friends, Stone, Anthony, and Stanton. A schism that one historian called, and I really love this phrase for it, the saddest divorce in American history. And it ended up pitting for the next 20 years Lucy Stone on one side and Stanton and Anthony on the other. And the grounds for the disagreement was that Lucy Stone believed in supporting the 15th Amendment. She was bitterly disappointed by it, but she said that a woman has an ocean of wrongs too deep for any plummet, and the Negro, too, has an ocean of wrongs that cannot be fathomed. I will be thankful in my soul if anybody can get out of this terrible pit. Stanton and Anthony disagreed. They supported only universal suffrage and said that if only one group could get the voting rights, it should be women. And they did so in very, very racist terms. In my book, I include a number of these quotes. For the purposes of the slideshow, I left it as a relatively low-key one, which was Elizabeth Cady Stanton saying, "I will not support men of other races making laws for," and of course she meant the white daughters of Jefferson, Hancock, and Adams. And this led to a schism between them. These were women of, strong wills, iron dispositions, and just like they had been great friends, they now became fierce rivals. So the 15th Amendment, of course, was adopted, as you all know, to the US Constitution. And on the heels of this divisive convention in 1869, two competing suffrage organizations were formed. Anthony and Stanton formed the National Woman Suffrage Association based in New York to pursue a federal amendment. They began a newspaper called The Revolution that was published for 2 years and then ran out of money. Lucy Stone began the Boston-based American Woman Suffrage Association. She also began a newspaper which was published for 50 years, every single week from 1870 through 1920. It was an inclusive organization. She welcomed blacks and men to join her. And her goal was the same, which history books often say Lucy Stone or the American Woman Suffrage Association just wanted to amend state constitutions. That is not at all the case. What is the case is that Lucy Stone had her eye on the long game, and she said, how are we going to get support from Congress? The only way it's going to happen is if we have a critical number of senators and congressmen beholden to women voters from their home state. So first we have to amend a critical number of state constitutions and franchise women in those states, and then we can work toward the federal amendment. And her long game turned out to be the one that worked. Now, hopefully, if you've all been listening, you're sitting here thinking to yourself something like this. If what I've been saying is true, how come I don't know all these things? Unless, of course, you're one of the people who does know all these things. Why don't I know more about Lucy Stone, the Worcester Convention, the American Women's Suffrage Association, and the Women's Journal? And the short answer, of course, is that history is not necessarily what happened. History is the story that somebody decides to tell us about what happened. And during the next 20 years of schism, undoubtedly the most important thing that Stanton and Anthony did was write a one-sided version of history. They wrote the first 2 volumes of what would ultimately become a 6-volume work known as the History of Women's Suffrage. And that became a source later on when women's historians began to look back. The other thing that you should know, and we'll talk more about later, is that Lucy Stone died in 1893, just 3 years after they reconciled, while Anthony lived all the way till 1906 and becomes an icon for a new generation of activists because a lot of things happened at the turn of the century that we'll talk about. So what was it that the American Women's Suffrage Association was busy doing? Well, it modeled itself on the success of the abolitionist movement. So the first thing that the American Women's Suffrage Association and Lucy Stone did was encourage leaders in different states to form state suffrage associations, like the MWSA, the Massachusetts Women's Suffrage Association, and these were formed across the North. And the idea was that they would then spawn local suffrage associations, like a Cambridge Women's Suffrage Association, or sometimes they were called equal suffrage leagues. Julia Ward Howe, who had become very famous during the Civil War when she penned the words "To Battle Hymn of the Republic," became the leader of the Massachusetts Women's Suffrage Association. She was also a founder of the New England Women's Club, so also a very active and involving woman through that vehicle. This is the home where Lucy Stone and her husband and daughter lived in Dorchester. This is an example of what the Women's Journal looks like, although when we get closer to 1920, the font is bigger and there are cartoons. I told you that Lucy Stone welcomed blacks and men also into the movement. Perhaps the most important local African-American suffragist was a woman named Josephine St. Pierre Ruffin, who joined these various organizations, but also began in a very important organization of African-American women, a women's club called the Women's Era Club. You may have heard of it. And a Women's Era newspaper that published for several years. Her allies included Maria Baldwin, a famous principal in Cambridge after whom the Baldwin Elementary School is named. And Josephine St. Pierre Ruffin called together the first ever convention of black women's clubs in 1895 in Boston. And that led to the beginning of a movement, of an organization of African-American women's clubs in this country. It's very, very important. So I mentioned to you that the American Women's Suffrage Association was dedicated to supporting state campaigns, deciding that that was the right strategy. And what was fascinating as you look at the history is that even though women's suffrage had arisen in the Northeast, it actually took root in the very friendly, it found out, settler societies of the West. So the first 4 states that actually amended their state constitutions, or in some cases they were the brand new constitutions of new states, to enfranchise women were actually Wyoming, Colorado, Utah, and Idaho, which many people are often surprised about. And the reasons are complicated, but sort of the overview, quick reason, is that these settler societies did not have conservative institutions like we had in states like Massachusetts. They didn't have banks. They didn't have conservative universities. They didn't have this level of a conservative upper class. It was a pioneer society where they needed women to come. They wanted women to come and settle out west, and they had great respect for the work that women were doing. Women were much more partners. So they began to enfranchise women in the West. And how about Massachusetts? Because, of course, Lucy Stone had hoped that Massachusetts would quickly enfranchise women and become a poster child for enfranchising women in the northeastern United States. That didn't happen, and the reason emblemizes what was going on after the Civil War. And again, we need another historical period, because now we move into the Gilded Age, the era of great fortunes, mass industrialization, monopolies, and so forth. There were enormous changes in states like Massachusetts and really all across the country after the Civil War. This was, a heyday of immigration. Irish immigrants had, of course, begun coming before the Civil War with the potato famine, but many, many more immigrants came after the Civil War. Lots more Irish came, Eastern European Jews, Russians, Germans, Italians, and others. So the population changed. Many of these people came, of course, to work in factories. This was, high point of growth of industry. These immigrant groups were welcomed into the Democratic Party. The Democratic Party was the party of the working class and the party of immigrants. And these immigrants viewed with distrust the Republican Party and women suffragists because they had earlier on been allied with the Republican Party when the Republican Party was the party of abolitionism. Also, many of these immigrants, of course, came from conservative, traditional patriarchal societies and had no interest in women's rights independently. The Republicans, for their part, stopped being the party of reform and becomes the party of big business. And they had no interest in women's rights. They wanted the status quo. And additionally, many of them worried that women might be inherently more sympathetic to the plight of women working in factories, child laborers, and so forth, and support laws that would make it harder for the Republicans, the party of big business, to amass their fortunes and have things the way they wanted. There was also a resurgence of the belief in separate spheres. So cartoons like this, which of course is the counterpoint to the one we saw earlier, similar idea, that if woman has the vote, look what will happen at home. A man's world would be turned topsy-turvy, and he would lose his stature and status as head of the family. The US Supreme Court, for its part, weighs in, writing that the constitution of the family indicates the domestic sphere as that which properly belongs to the domain and functions of womanhood. So now what? Well, Lucy Stone and her allies were ever inventive, and they said, okay, if we can't win suffrage in a state like Massachusetts, let's try to get our foot in the door, get a toe in the door, and then once we have a toe in the door, we can get the door to open wider. And there was a movement, initially actually not supported by Lucy Stone because it was so narrow, but there was a movement toward school committee suffrage. The idea being that the legislature would be willing, and it proved correct, to enfranchise women to vote for school committee because raising and educating children had, after all, always been a primary role of women. So women in 1879 got the vote for school committees, and one of the first women to cast her vote was Louisa May Alcott, the author of Little Women, of course. Then they decided to go for what Lucy Stone had wanted to do in the first place, municipal suffrage, suffrage in city and town elections. And they made a similar argument to what had been used in the school committee elections. Not a radical argument, but an argument based on women's traditional roles. Who better than women to clean up messes wherever they are, including in the city? Who better than women to make sure that there's safe water, pure food, safe streets, clean parks, playgrounds, and so forth? So there was a big movement toward municipal suffrage. And it looked like it was going to pass the legislature. And as that happened, a movement of anti-suffragists was organized in Massachusetts. It was led by women, but it was funded by conservative Republican men and financed by them. They began a newspaper called the Remonstrance, and ultimately, the anti-suffrage movement in Massachusetts would actually prove to be the most powerful one in the country, because Massachusetts was a real bastion of Republican conservatism during the Gilded Age. Some of the abolitionists had remained radicals, but they were now at this point largely outnumbered, or very much outnumbered. So municipal suffrage was actually put out for a non-binding vote of the voters of Massachusetts. Women who were registered to vote for school committee were allowed to vote, and all men who were registered to vote. And it was defeated tremendously by men. 96% of the women who voted in favor of extending suffrage, but by an over 2-to-1 margin, the men recommended against it. So that was the end of that. It was very depressing in 1895. And the following year, there was also a big loss in the West. There was a defeat of a women's suffrage amendment in California, which brought to an end the recent run of victories in the West. So it was clear as we're approaching the close of the century that there was need to be a restart, new strategizing, something was going to have to happen. And fortunately, things were well poised for that to happen because a few years earlier, finally, the now elderly Lucy Stone and Stanton and Anthony had all reconciled. Kicking and screaming, but they had reconciled. Pushed to do so by Lucy Stone's daughter, who was now a young woman, Alice Stone Blackwell, and some people, others of the second generation, who basically told them that nobody understands the causes of the schism anymore. The 15th Amendment has been on the books for 20 years. We still have only won several states. We can't afford to have two competing organizations. And they formed the National American Women's Suffrage Association. Lucy Stone never plays much of a role in it. She dies just 3 years later of cancer. Stanton, who really didn't particularly care for organizational work, moves to England and lives with her daughter there for a while and continues to really communicate by writing. And it's Anthony who takes the helm, and she leads the new National American Women's Suffrage Association, often called NASA, for the next 10 years. And then she remains its elder statesman until her death in 1906. Also at this time, we're approaching happily for our story, and for other reasons too, the end of the Gilded Age and the beginning of a new era, yet another new era in American history, the Progressive Era. And the Progressive Era, as you all know and as its name suggests, was an era of progress, an era of new inventions ranging from the bicycle, subways, electric lights, the telephone, new opportunities for women. More women attended high school, more women were able to obtain higher education. There were some clothing reforms, partly stimulated by things like the bicycle. And the country as a whole felt that it was important somehow, even if they disagreed over the particular tactics, that the challenges posed by overcrowded cities, poverty, unsafe factories, and so forth had to be addressed somehow. So that was very important, but it was also an era of continued racism. The Jim Crow laws were alive and well, of course, in the South, and there was tremendous prejudice in the North as well. Also, lots of anti-immigration, nativism sentiment. So that was also very powerful, even as we entered the Progressive Era. And of course, Woodrow Wilson, who we'll talk about, who many of you know was elected as a progressive, of course, was very racist himself, just to take one example. So in 1900, as the Progressive Era is getting underway, Susan B. Anthony, who is now 80, steps down from leading the National American Women's Suffrage Association, and she is succeeded by a brilliant organizer named Carrie Chapman Catt. And Carrie Chapman Catt continued the state focus that had worked for the American Women's Suffrage Association, but she also fully adopted the racism that was in the National Women's Suffrage Association. And that was partly because it was the Jim Crow era, partly because many of these women were indeed racist, and partly because, practically speaking, they knew that someday, if there was going to be a women's suffrage amendment, they were going to have support of some congressmen and senators from southern states, as they were willing to make a pact with the devil when it came to race. Carrie Chapman Catt also created something called the Society Plan, which meant reaching out to wealthy widows and other people with resources to help provide money for the suffrage campaign, which was very important because it had always struggled tremendously financially, which is not something I have time to go into right now, but an important point to talk about. Very important allies of Carrie Chapman Catt and some of the things she did. One of my favorite women is Maud Wood Park, who graduated from Radcliffe in 1898 and founded the College Equal Suffrage League, an organization of college students and alums, first in Massachusetts, and it was so successful and proved so helpful in bringing new, energetic young women into the movement that she was actually asked to make it a national movement, which she did. She traveled around the country organizing college equal suffrage leagues. Another person with Cambridge links is Florence Luscombe, who was very big on what were called open-air meetings. The idea being, it's fine if people want to come to a lecture hall like we're in tonight, but how much better if you really want to reach the people you need to persuade, to not invite them someplace where they might not come, but to go out on a town green, or go to the beach, or go to a county fair, and pass out leaflets and talk about the reasons for women's suffrage, and try to reach the apathetic, the uninformed, and so forth. And so she, in her words, that the movement needed to go out of the parlor and into the streets. And as a result of this new energy, these young women, something very, very important happened, and that is the image of the women's suffrage movement began to change. You know, even though it had been growing all these years, the national press, for the most part, still poo-pooed the movement and depicted suffragists the way the figure on the left looks to you here, as somebody who is unattractive, masculinized, probably a spinster. And now the suffrage movement began to be women like Maud Wood Park and Florence Luscombe and other young, energetic, attractive women. And this generated so much new attention. One of my favorite quotations is written by a friend of Maud Wood Park's when she's away traveling, and she writes to her, "The movement, which when we got into it had about as much energy as a dying kitten, is now actually fashionable." It actually becomes a more diverse movement. Still largely white, there were always some African Americans who supported the women's suffrage movement very much, but they weren't necessarily invited to be major figures in the movement. But the movement was now willing to accept white women of other ethnicities. So Mary Kenny O'Sullivan became very, very important, also from she wasn't from Massachusetts, but had moved to Massachusetts, and she founded the Women's Trade Union League, which helped bring factory workers, immigrant women working in factories, union women, into the suffrage movement, explaining to them the connection between things like working conditions and the vote. She also formed an alliance with the American Federation of Labor and helped develop a strong alliance with labor unions. And labor unions began to realize that if they supported the right of women to vote, that women might help them, that in fact women might do things like limit hours that people could work and impose safety conditions in factories and so forth. Another one of my favorites locally is a woman named Margaret Foley, who engaged in high-profile, inventive campaign tactics. She would have been brilliant with social media. So for instance, this picture shows her going up at a county fair in a hot air balloon with her Votes for Women banner. Jenny Leutman-Barron was the daughter of Jewish immigrants from Russia. She founded the Boston University Equal Suffrage League and became a leading person on this open-air speaking circuit. And as a result of all this new energy brought into the suffrage movement, the progressive era, the turn of the century, new blood, there was a whole string of new victories. And all the states you see on the screen enfranchised women over the next years between 1910 and 1914. So now the question was, now that the West has so many women able to vote, could the suffrage tide surge east? And this is what the map looked like, really, of the country at this point. You can see how women's suffrage is entirely, or virtually entirely, a Western phenomenon. The one exception is Illinois, when women were allowed to vote for presidential electors. In 1915, 4 very important northeastern states, Massachusetts, New York, New Jersey, and Pennsylvania, all considered the question of whether or not to amend their state constitutions to enfranchise women. And the suffragists organized similar campaigns in each one of these 4 states. I'll just show you some images for the Massachusetts one, but this really could have been anywhere. The first is they continued to make use of trolleys and county fairs and so forth, but they also now used automobiles. They did things like create fans that they passed out at various events. This one says, while watching the horse race, don't forget one half the human race. They plastered bluebirds like this one, about 100,000 of them, all around the state to bring attention. They did whatever they could to get attention, to keep the issue in the news, and to put it in people's minds. They held parades like this one, 2 major parades held in Boston, but also many other parades held in other major cities like Worcester and Springfield, but also in towns. Different cities and towns sent floats to these various parades, and I would imagine, although I didn't have a chance to look, that Cambridge very likely had a float and marchers in at least one of the parades in 1914 or 1915, if not both. Harvard and Radcliffe students definitely marched in the 1915 parade. But the anti-suffragists had not gone away. They were still out in force, still claiming that if women could vote, it would really be the end of civilization as we know it. I mean, think if you're trying to get your head around them, I often think about women opposed to the Equal Rights Amendment in our own lifetimes. I mean, the same sort of thing, this notion that the way it is the way it should be, and they did not want change. They had cartoons like this, showing the horrible fates that would befall women if they gained suffrage, because as this woman goes up the steps, she leaves behind love, marriage, children, and home. And once she gets suffrage, the 3 steps afterwards are strife, anxiety, and loneliness, which tells you what was in store for women if they were enfranchised. So what happened? Did the women of Massachusetts get the vote in 1915? Anybody? You're correct. How about in New York, New Jersey, and Pennsylvania? New York in 1917, but not in 1915. The answer is it was defeated in all 4 of these states, but the largest margin of defeat was in our own state of Massachusetts. These other 3 states, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and Massachusetts, did not try again on a state level. In New York, it was deemed that another effort might prove fruitful, and New York tried again and did actually enfranchise women in 1917. So how do we get from these remarkable major defeats in 1915 to success only 5 years later? I better check my watch. It's a complicated story, and all I can do is give you the bare outlines of it. But what I'm going to do is tell you some of the different things that happened, the trends that occurred over the next 5 years that led to victory in just 5 years. The first is that the National American Women's Suffrage Association adopted a new strategy, which I will tell you about. The second is that there was a new organization called the National Women's Party. The third is World War I, and then 2 others that I'm not going to talk about later on, so I'll mention them now. The Prohibition Amendment was adopted in this country before women's suffrage, and that was very important because there were a lot of women involved in the temperance and prohibition movements. And the liquor industry had poured a lot of money into defeating women's suffrage because they were so worried that if women gained the vote, that they would impose prohibition. Once prohibition had happened anyway, the liquor industry stopped putting its money into defeating women's suffrage. Also, during World War I, which we'll talk about in a moment, a number of European nations began to enfranchise women. And so the United States did not want to be left out for reasons I'll explain. So what was the winning plan? Carrie Chapman Catt said, after these defeats in the Northeast, that we basically have all the states we can win for now. We have the western part of the country, we just lost the Northeast, and the South, which was so busy taking away, of course, voting rights from black men, was not about to extend voting rights to anybody new, so the South was seen as hopeless. So she decided, Catt, that the time was now ripe to finally focus on a federal amendment. And she invited Maud Wood Park, the founder of the College Equal Suffrage League, to come to Washington and be the lead lobbyist. Maud Wood Park worked with many, many other lobbyists, mostly from individual states, women of means who could afford to come to Washington, D.C., who would meet with their own congressmen or senators. Maud Wood Park was the organizational arm behind all of that. So very important. But then there was Alice Paul and some of the young suffragists, about 5% of them. Alice Paul had gone to England, where she had, in around the years 1909, become part of the Women's Social and Political Union, the militant group of suffragists known as suffragettes, which was a moniker given to them by the British press, in England. And Alice Paul had become convinced that what was needed, as the Women's Social and Political Union did in England, were deeds, not words. In some ways, it was a generational thing. Young women like Alice Paul were tired of the patience and restraint shown by people like Carrie Chapman Catt. They wanted to get out and take action. And Alice Paul and her friend Lucy Burns organized what was called the National Woman's Party. And they did things that brought a lot of notoriety to the movement, and brought a lot of critical attention, but also a lot of attention, and attention was important. And they were the ones who did things like protest in front of the White House, the so-called silent sentinels, holding signs. Many of them were arrested, and when they were arrested, they demanded to be treated as political prisoners. And when the prison officials refused to do so, they went on hunger strikes, and then they were force-fed. And that brought a wave of sympathetic publicity to them, because even people, many men, who did not want women to vote, still didn't really like the idea of their being force-fed and treated in that manner. So the National Women's Party was pursuing its strategy, the National Women's Party was pursuing its strategy, and meanwhile, in 1917, the United States entered World War I, which of course had begun several years earlier in Europe. And when Woodrow Wilson, who had been opposed to women's suffrage, entered the war, he claimed that the US was doing so to make the world safe for democracy. And at that point in time, several European countries had already enfranchised women. Finland, Norway, Denmark, for example. Russia did so in 1917 after the Bolshevik Revolution. Other countries were discussing it. And Woodrow Wilson finally realized that it would be best for him in terms of the future that he wanted, the League of Nations, the US becoming a power on the world stage, if this divisive issue of women's suffrage were finally put behind him. And so he belatedly embraced the cause of women's suffrage. And then, of course, World War I, just like the Civil War, brought new and expanded roles for women. Women became partners in the war effort. So after the war, Wilson, as I said, endorsed the 19th Amendment. It was passed by the House of Representatives and defeated in October 1918 in the Senate by 2 votes. Now, of course, if it was defeated in October 1918, you all know what happens in November 1918, an election. And so the suffragists said, okay, we have to find 2 senators to target who are up for re-election, and of course only 1/3 of the Senate's up every 2 years. They have to be up for re-election, they have to be opposed to suffrage, and their opponent has to be a suffrage supporter. There's no point in defeating one opponent to get another opponent. So they targeted 2 senators, and one of them happened to be Senator John Weeks of Massachusetts, a very conservative former mayor of Newton, a Republican, very opposed to suffrage. And they ran a campaign against Weeks that used a lot of the tactics from the 1915 campaign, but it was even more inventive and imaginative. Because what they did is they decided not to attack John Weeks just for opposing women. They had lost that way in 1917 over the State Amendment, 1915. They decided to target John Weeks for all the different votes that he had cast against progressive causes that many voters in Massachusetts now supported. Teresa Crowley, a suffragist, I'm not sure if she was actually from Cambridge. She was one of the early lawyers. I think she lived in Boston. She went to Washington, D.C. and researched Weeks' letter. And they published ads like this, leaflets like this, pointing out all the bad votes that John Weeks had cast, only one of which was against the amendment that would enfranchise women. Well, Weeks was defeated, as was the senator from Delaware that they had targeted. That paved the way for Congress to finally propose to the states the 19th Amendment, and it was sent out for ratification. You probably all know this part of the story, that the requisite 36th state was Tennessee, which ratified the 19th Amendment in August of 2020, therefore paving the way for women to be able to vote across the country in November of 1920. This is what the Woman's Journal looked like. It had been renamed the last several years the Woman's Citizen. And I'm going to end with just a couple of points. The first is, does anybody know what happened to the National American Women's Suffrage Association after victory in 1920? Did it just kind of go home and disappear? Does anybody have any idea? Yes? It most certainly did become the League of Women Voters. Well, that's wonderful. The League of, not enough people know that. I'm always amazed that not everybody knows this, but the League of Women Voters really maybe hasn't yet publicized its history as well as it should. Because not only will 2020 be the 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment, it's also the 100th birthday of the wonderful League of Women Voters. And you can see the first national board here, with Carrie Chapman Catt as the honorary president and Maud Wood Park as the first national president of the League of Women Voters. And of course, this wouldn't be an American story if it just had a happy ending. The women's suffrage victory was a huge victory, and nothing should take away from the fact that it was a great victory. But it was, of course, also an imperfect victory. No sooner were black women enfranchised by virtue of the 19th Amendment than they were immediately disenfranchised in the South, just like black men had been disenfranchised. And black men and women would really not gain the right to vote in this country until the Voting Rights Act of the 1960s. And I probably don't need to tell a Cambridge audience how much under threat voting rights remain today in various parts of the country. Also, courts read the 19th Amendment narrowly by and large. So for instance, in Massachusetts and a number of other states, women claimed that the 19th Amendment, if it gave them the right to vote, it certainly should give them the right to certain other basic attributes of citizenship, like sitting on juries. And the Massachusetts Supreme Judicial Court, where my day job is, said no. They basically said the 19th Amendment was such a radical proposition that we should not extend it beyond the clear words, and what it talks about is the vote. And women of Massachusetts actually were not able to sit on juries until 1950, another 30 years. Also, of course, all sorts of other inequalities remained in 1920. Much progress has been made, as you all know, in the area of employment and equal pay and sexual harassment and other things, but of course inequalities remain as we stand here today in 2019. So it was definitely an imperfect victory, but nonetheless it was a great victory because it ensured that women of this country now had available for their use the most important tool in the democratic toolbox, the tool, of course, of the ballot. And there's also so many lessons to be learned from the suffragists when you think about our own era and some of the battles going on and the struggles that we're facing. The importance of persisting, the importance of never giving up, the importance of realizing, which is very hard to do in our modern era, that change can take a long time, that just because you lose one election or two elections or even 3 elections doesn't mean you give up and go home. It means you roll up your sleeves and continue to work harder and harder. So there's an awful lot of lessons to be learned that are positive from the women's suffrage movement. There's also, of course, the more concerning lessons about exclusion, which remains, of course, a problem within this nation today. So I am going to stop there, and I would love to have people not only ask questions about anything I've talked about or whatever else is on your mind related to the suffrage movement or women's rights more broadly. I'd also love to hear your comments. And I know often in audiences there are people carrying around family stories of mothers, grandmothers, great-grandmothers, and so forth who are active in the movement. And so if you have stories like that that you'd like to share, we'd also love to hear from you.